So I've entitled this The Role of the Apple in 19th Century American Westward Expansion into Colorado. I want to present one caveat right here, and that is that my sources were very Anglo in nature. So I didn't get to the depth of looking at Spanish sources or French sources when we're talking about early apple development on the continent. We're basically working off of Anglo sources. And you'll see why I'm referencing that here in just one moment. So let's begin. And there it goes. I'm gonna have to scroll, okay. Here's the research question that I basically worked off of, folks. I'm always working off of a research question and then sub-questions. Why was the apple important to westward movement of people in Colorado? And why the apple and not other fruits? So context, right? Historic context. The first Anglo apple orchard that is on record in the Americas was on a place where I used to live, and that is Boston. Another first for Boston, right? There were gentlemen moved to the Boston area before it was colonized, so before the large amount of people came there, and he basically had Boston to himself. He was farming where the Common is now located, for those of you who know that. And he planted what is known to be the first orchard, apple orchard, in 1625. This is a rendering of his very humble abode next to the Charles River here. He was a reverend. It's an interesting story. He's an interesting guy, a little bit of a hermit. In 1630, when the colony up in Boston became and moved into that area, they moved to Charlestown. Charlestown had no water. Those settlers up there wanted to move over to Boston. Blackstone sold them some land, and then pretty quickly he got tired of them. And he moved to the western part of Massachusetts, to the Blackstone Valley, which was named after him. And he did agricultural pursuits in the Blackstone Valley. So that is the Anglo version of the first apple orchard in the Americas. There may have been something older in Spanish colonies, possibly in Dutch, as they were there in Manhattan in 1624, but likely this is the oldest apple orchard. So as you're beginning to look at apples in the early 1800s, oftentimes something that pops up is this myth that I think we're all familiar with, and the story of Johnny Appleseed. Well, it turns out that the story of Johnny Appleseed actually has a lot of utility to historians because, of course, it was based on a real person. John Chapman lived from 1774 to 1845. He was a missionary, which was the reason that he was moving around all the time, is that he was trying to convert people to Christianity in the Midwest. And he also was a nurseryman, so he had experience with horticulture. The interesting part about the myth versus the reality of Johnny Appleseed was, as a child, I just assumed because his name was Johnny Appleseed that he was planting seeds or spreading seeds. That is not necessarily the case, and this is a little bit of a technicality, but it's important to the rest of the presentation. What he was doing was moving around what now we would consider the eastern part of the Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, even Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, areas around there. And he was imploring people to plant nurseries with those seeds, not orchards. And many people did that. They planted the nurseries. Nurseries don't need as much space. They're not going to be grown to full height. They're going to be grown for a year or two and then pulled out and packaged as a commercial object. and sold to other people. So what Johnny Appleseed actually was doing was conducting business in that section of the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. And he was making very good money, because what he would do is that he would sell seeds to people, they would plant them, and then he would collect year after year a percentage of their take as they sold those trees to people. So this is a big way that the apple was getting spread. Now, that's not to say that nobody was planting trees and then harvesting them for apples. They were doing that, but mostly the commercial objective was to grow saplings and to sell those to people that wanted to grow their own orchards. Through this process, he passed along knowledge of cultivation and propagation, because, as I said, he was a nurseryman and an expert in doing that. And as I said, he returned season after season to get money, a portion of the sale of the trees, a percentage of it, and he did very well doing that. He was an adept businessman. So if we think of Johnny Appleseed as being a proponent of the apple and of growing apples, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one of our favorite people here at the McAllister house, and that is Andrew Jackson Downing. Andrew Jackson Downing was the primary proponent of growing apple trees and apple orchards in the early United States. He does this through a number of different vehicles. He started and was the editor of Horticulture magazine, which is a very popular magazine in the 1840s. But the primary document that he creates regarding fruit is this book here called Fruit and Fruit-Trees of America, and it was published in 1847. Downing believed that every man should cultivate an orchard of good fruit for both himself and the public. And everybody in every sense will be the gainers, is what his quote is. The goals of this book were to increase the taste for planting and cultivation of fruit trees, but also to furnish a technical manual or a guide in the operations of culture and selection of varieties. I have a inkling that McAllister was familiar with Andrew Jackson Downing, and it might have been through horticulture and this book, The Fruits and Fruit Trees of America, that McAllister became familiar with Andrew Jackson Downing. In the image here, I'm just giving you a little bit of information, a little piece of what is contained in the Fruit and Fruit Trees of America. Here's a section on the early harvest. He addresses every single varietal known. This is a 1,200-page document. It's absolutely huge with illustrations. Not only does it have descriptions of varietals like this and where they've come from, these are different regional varietals that are offshoots of early harvest and information about those varietals. But he also has highly technical information. Both of these images are from that book. And you can see on the left, complicated aspects of grafting, things that I never knew existed, to be perfectly honest with you. I hope some of you are horticulturalists in your background, and maybe you could experiment with some of these things. But grafting, all sorts of technical aspects of how to obtain both the variety that you're looking for, but also how to grow different types of apple trees that will grow in different environments. So let's take a look at some of the very earliest agriculturalists in Colorado, again, just so we have some context of agriculture. These people didn't necessarily grow fruit trees. Some of them may have. Documentation of some of these older agriculturalists is not great, but I just want to set the stage for us with agriculture in the state so that we're all on the same page and have a good understanding. Of course, we go back to those ancestral Puebloans, and the date that we can find is about 350 BC that they first started with agriculture in the Four Corners region. Next, chronologically, we have a party. The Fisher Party comes out into the Pueblo area in approximately 1842. It is not known whether they planted any fruit trees at that time in the Pueblo area, but we will talk a lot about the Pueblo area here in a few minutes. That ends up being a significant area for fruit in the state of Colorado. George S. Simpson came out early, 1843-44, in the Hardscrabble Valley near Florence, Colorado, so not too far from us. Good agricultural valley. We know that he participated in agriculture there. We do not know if he planted any fruit trees. And then an interesting one coming up from Santa Fe in the Taos area is that a colony came up into the San Luis Valley in 1850. There had already been sheep herders and other types of horticulturalists in that area, but they were the first formal colony of people to come up into the San Luis Valley, and they settled a small town named Guadalupe on the northern banks of the Conejos River, and they were irrigation farming. It's highly likely that they planted some fruit down in that area. So chronologically, we're going to take the next step, folks, and that is to go into the pioneer period and take a look at what miners and homesteaders were doing in Colorado. That period is approximately from 1858 to 1870. The boundaries of those dates, of course, are the beginnings of mining in Colorado. And then the ending date of that is the railroad coming into Colorado substantially. So that's the boundaries of this time period that we're going to take a look at here. So if you recall, the last geographical region that we were talking about with Johnny Appleseed was more in the Midwest, closer to the Mississippi River. And what we know was occurring in those areas is that those Midwesterners were growing nurseries. They also were growing apples. Apples were a product, but also the nurseries, the saplings were a product. So how was that getting out to Colorado? How does that relate to Colorado agriculture? Well, they were exporting dried apples, and the miners and homesteaders were buying lots and lots of dried apples. Apples can be used for apple pie, apple fritters. Those are the two main products of that day that dried apples were used for. It's really interesting to see that there already is a network coming into Colorado, and that these distributors from the Midwest will actually deliver all the way to the mining towns in the mountains. Of course, you're going to pay a premium for that, but if we think about Amazon and how widely distributed products are today, it's pretty amazing to think that they would have delivered to your mining camp in Gold Hill up in Boulder County, say, or up to Georgetown, to miners up in Georgetowns and those sorts of places. It must have cost them a lot to do that, but it's amazing to think that they were going that far. So miners and homesteaders coming into Colorado starting in 1858, and they were in desire of dried apples. Obviously, the reason for dried apples is transport. You could dry apples and you could ship them long distances. They wouldn't be bruised. They wouldn't have problems with them. And then they could be used at different temperatures and readily. Now, you might think that if you were a miner, it would be pretty great if you could have an apple pie. But in reading the literature, it was interesting to see that these miners up there in those cold areas in the mountains that had these tough lives were not necessarily always grateful that they were getting an apple pie from these dried apples, and they began to make fun of them. And you actually find this in the literature in many places, that the miners were making fun of specifically the dried apples and the shall we say, lack of quality of the product, apple pies, that these dried apples would make. I'm going to read this quote as part of this limerick. This is kind of a limerick that could be found in newspapers. This is from the Rocky Mountain News. And this is a miner being quoted, or a limerick where a miner is being quoted. He believes in big vegetables because he can see them, but wonders if there's any other kind of fruit than dried apples. Dried apples scalded, and dried apples with the strings in. I'll admit to you folks that I had to figure out what they meant by dried apples with strings in. Some of you may know, but what that means is that the seeds had sprouted and then the apple had been dried. So you might receive some of these dried apple pieces that have these worm-like looking strings in them. They're perfectly edible. It doesn't cause any problem, except for that visually it's maybe a little bit disgusting, maybe even to hardcore miners like this in Colorado. So during this period of time, the big influx of people begins with the Homestead Act in 1862. Take a look at Colorado and the territory that's opened up by the Homestead Act. These tracts that you see that aren't opened up by the Homestead Act are where the railroad and where the major river valleys are. So the railroad would have bought up all of this land and they weren't going to sell it. Same thing with down here in southern Colorado along the Arkansas. So you've got the Platte and the Arkansas, right? Millions of acres opened up. This is just a small part of it. Can whoever just came on turn off their audio for us? Could you mute your audio? Thank you. Any adults, including women, who had never taken up arms against the federal government were eligible for the Homestead Act. Immigrants, even who had applied for citizenship were eligible. And it's interesting, the timetable, look at 1862, right at the beginning of the Civil War. Legislation had been proposed for years similar to the Homestead Act, and it had been blocked by the Democrats of the South for all those years because they did not want to open up these areas simply to homesteaders. They wanted to open them up to plantation owners, of course. So it doesn't get passed until the secession, and then those Democrats, those Southern Democrats, are not voting, and the legislation passes, signed into law by Lincoln. And interestingly, Horace Greeley was one of the leading proponents. We'll be mentioning him here in just a moment. So at this time, nurseries are established in the Midwest, and these nurseries that we're talking about, they keep moving further and further west. So instead of being when Johnny Appleseed was planting trees and selling trees in Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, now we're talking about nurseries full on into the Midwest, the Mississippi Basin, the Missouri River Basin. We've got nurseries as close to us as Kansas and Nebraska during this period of time. And they're doing pretty good business by shipping trees at this point to the West, although the market certainly hasn't opened up to a large amount of people. That won't happen until the railroad era that we'll be talking about in just a moment. But what they're doing is that they are learning the efficiencies and the right types of manner in which to package these trees, the time of the year that they're best packaged for planting. And then the people in Colorado are learning too when the best time to order, how long they're going to get there, things like that. So we're going to start to see fruit culture in Colorado here pretty quickly. One of the interesting things that we can see in this ad, which is coming from St. Louis, Missouri, is that they are providing printed directions for setting out and cultivating that will accompany their delivery of plants. So we're really starting to develop a sophisticated and comprehensive network of economy of apple trees. This isn't happening with other fruits so much. Apple trees are the primary aspect of this. So at the same time, these Midwestern nurseries are feeding the growth out here into Colorado, I just needed to mention that they're also doing something else. They're feeding a growing international market. I was surprised to see this. Look at this quote: "Nothing astonishes the English more than our system of barreling apples." So the United States had actually developed their own systems for barreling apples. And what they were doing was putting them, first they were curing them in cool weather, and then they were putting them in barrels and packed with straw. And you could get barrels of apples to England that, even with the shipping and handling costs, the American distributors were able to undercut the price of apples in England. I'm sure there was a few English distributors that were a little bit miffed by that. The two popular, or the most popular types of apples, are the Rhode Island Greenings and Baldwins, the primary exports to England at that time. Earlier than that, previous to that, it had been the Newton Pippin that then became problematic as far as shipping, and these two types of apples were longer lasting in those barrels. So back to Colorado and a realization of this Western market, as I'm calling it. So take a look at some of this information. This is in the Out West newspaper, but it's using information from the Omaha Herald. And it's saying that no men in Nebraska are realizing more fully upon investment than those who are at an early day planted orchards and now enjoying their fruits and its proceeds. These orchards in a particular counties that were very profitable could make $700 to $4,000 with an orchard. Single trees were said to have paid more to their owners than 10 acres of corn at the present rates. That's 1872 rates. I think that's pretty amazing. That shows us a little bit about what's driving apples west. In Colorado, some homesteaders and miners are beginning to become fruit growers themselves. They see this market, there's a need, and they're starting to turn towards fruit growing from their mining or other agricultural pursuits. Much of the distribution of the trees for these people is going through Denver, and ranchers and miners have success growing these apple trees and begin to promote the apples as a source of revenue within the state of Colorado. And they begin to think about the economy of apples in Colorado as it becomes more sophisticated. So we're going to take a look here at a few individuals or families, folks, that were some of the early fruit growers and apple growers in Colorado. So just a little bit of biography, and we've got some different regions covered with this. So I hope this is interesting to folks. The Bowles family, interesting family. Joseph Bowles came to Colorado in 1859 for the mining era. He soon went up to Blackhawk, which was called Gregory Gulch at the time. He didn't have a lot of success and moved on to Nevada. Came back from Nevada, not much success there, and returned to Littleton, Colorado in 1862. Remember the Homestead Act, 1862, right? So he applies and receives his homestead in 1867. In the meantime, he had built a log cabin along the Platte, and he welcomed his new bride, Cynthia. He was the first person to plant an apple orchard in the Denver area in that Platte River basin, and he planted saplings in 1868, 1869, and this is reported in the Rocky Mountain News. This was big news for Colorado at that time. His orchards bear fruit in 1872. The Bowles family, he was very successful with farming ventures, and he even got into ranching considerably. Remember that territorial map? Well, he was running from the Bar 11 Ranch. He was running cattle from the north all the way to the south, Arkansas, from the Platte River Basin to the Arkansas River Basin. That also happened to be territory that the Cheyenne and Arapaho were awfully fond of. In 1884, the Bowles family hired noted Denver architect Robert Rosenschlaub, known for Central City Opera House, Trinity Methodist Church, and the Chamberlain Observatory, to build their grand home, Willowcroft. Unfortunately, in 2013, Willowcroft was demolished, and there is a nice new home development there now called Willowcroft. That's just off of Bowles Avenue in Littleton. So another individual that we'll take a look at up in Boulder County is Joseph Wolfe. Joseph Wolfe was probably the greatest proponent of fruit culture in Colorado. Here's one of his famous quotes, that fruit culture is a system of experimenting and must for many years be largely in that condition until experience shall determine what varieties to plant, the soil required, the proper tillage, the effective irrigation, mulching, fertilizers, etc., etc. He was a detail-oriented individual. He was a miner up in the Boulder area, up in Gold Hill. He had some success, and then he retired from mining and started growing fruit, and had a lot of success growing fruit in the Boulder area. Again, he was heavy on experimentation, and that was very beneficial during that time period because he was able to quickly adapt to the environment of the Boulder Valley area. He studied fruit experiments in the Midwest in cold winters, and he famously lost hundreds of trees of his orchards in a bad winter and actually a spring storm, the winter of 1873. But he was not deterred from this fruit culture, and he continued to be a proponent. This was his main claim. He was always arguing to stop the drain of money that impoverishes us and enriches other states, saying that Coloradans need to grow apples in Colorado for Coloradans and not be importing them from other places. He ends up being somebody that McAllister has debates and conversations with about apples a few years later. And then he's got this statement that apple trees will pay you tenfold more than you can make off the same amount of ground in any other kind of crop. So we've got some evidence of the value of apples at this point, and especially in Boulder County. Again, many miners turned agriculturalists when they didn't have success in mining, but you've basically got two different types of miners that would turn towards agriculture. Ones that were successful in mining, that had some money and some capital to put towards pomological pursuits, and then you had miners that didn't have success and that were not able to come up with that capital to put towards pomological pursuits, and they would have not been able to conduct pomological activity on a large scale. Wolfe was successful in mining and parlayed some of that capital into his mining endeavors in Boulder County. The other thing that happened in Boulder County very early is that they established the Boulder County Agricultural Society. So this was the first of its kind in Colorado, started in 1868. And it produces the first apple in Boulder County in 1872 by a man named Joseph Rhodes. The real reason for starting the Agricultural Society is this image right here, so that you can have cooperative action, which was needed for the construction of irrigation infrastructure. If you were going to do this on a larger scale, then you needed some cooperative action, and that's what we're indicating by this image of a ditch company that was established in Boulder County there. So now we're getting to Southern Colorado a little bit, folks, and probably the person that is the grandfather or the father of pomological activity in Colorado, and that is Uncle Jesse Frazier. But first, let me just mention William Lee. He planted the first orchard in Colorado, as far as I could see, in 1865 near Canon City. Unfortunately, it was destroyed that season and he never produced any fruit. So then somebody close by to him has been given the nod as having the first successful apple orchard in the state, and that is Jesse Frazier. He was down in the Florence area in 1859. He planted an orchard. Notice that he doesn't plant an orchard right away. He has to gain some capital, and then he plants an orchard in 1867 and establishes a nursery. His favorite apple down in that area in Southern Colorado was the Ben Davis. He ends up with 2,000 trees, apple, pears, and plums. He's very successful down there, harvesting 700 to 800 pounds of apples per tree. And just one note, in 79, it's his biggest year, $2,000 worth of fruit. Just to kind of give you a gauge as far as costs, we think that McAllister spent about $5,000 on the McAllister house here in 1873. Another individual, B.F. Rockefeller, planted an orchard, that's supposed to be planted, excuse me, an orchard where the Holy Cross Abbey is located down in Canon City. So that's Jesse Fraser. So now we're going to keep moving forward in time a little bit, folks, to another era. And this is basically the railroad era, or the colonization era of eastern Colorado. Just as a reminder, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869 in northern Utah, and it comes to Denver from Cheyenne in 1870. And then in 1871, Palmer brings the Denver and Rio Grande from Denver to Colorado Springs and then down to Pueblo. So just to remind us of the timetable there. So what we've got here during this era, folks, is people that are coming in. They're coming in planned groups. That's why we call them colonies or colonization. And Fountain Colony is a part of this too. So this is our comparing and contrasting to other aspects of population into the state at the same time, basically, that the Fountain Colony is being established. Now, one of the things that I think that is very interesting is there is a lot of communication between the leaders of these different colonies. So they are rarely coming into these situations blind. They have consulted with other people that have been in those areas as far as agriculture, mining, and other different pursuits. So the first of those colonies comes in 1870, and it is the Chicago or German colony. And remember that immigrants were also able to get their Homestead Act land. This colony was well organized, it seemed initially, and bought 40,000 acres in the Wet Mountain Valley. And they were around by the town of Colfax, which is 15 miles west of Westcliff. Well, it was difficult for that colony. There were organizational issues once they got on site, and it was a little bit more difficult to grow there than they had thought, and that colony ends up collapsing relatively quickly, and a second group follows them up and establishes a town called Hamel, which is now Wetmore, off of south of Route 50, south of Florence. Beautiful valley. The next colony that gets established is the Union Colony. This becomes probably the most successful colony of them all, at least during that time period. We won't compare it to Colorado Springs till present, but very successful early on. It was agriculturally oriented. Nathan Meeker was one of the organizers with Horace Greeley. Nathan Meeker was the agricultural editor, so obviously had some experience with agriculture, and Horace Greeley, the owner of the New York Tribune, had traveled out to Colorado in the 1860s and basically figured out that they wanted to start a colony then. They picked out the choicest agriculture land at the confluence of the South Platte and the Cache la Poudre rivers. That's 72,000 acres they bought from the railroad, and buying into this colony meant membership, and membership entitled you to a plot of land in town and then a larger plot of land outside of town for your agricultural pursuits, and it included the publicly maintained irrigation system, very similar to Fountain Colony, same with the free irrigation. Interestingly, it was the first prohibition town in the state of Colorado, formally prohibitions town, and Fountain Colony follows their lead on making Fountain Colony a prohibition town in the state also. The next colony is the Chicago, Colorado colony, also coming in 1871. They're coming into the Longmont area, and look at this beautiful picture. Does this remind you a little bit of our pictures of Pikes Peak? They certainly had their nice Long's Peak to look at too. And they were in a good position as far as irrigation, and at the confluence of the St. Vrain. Creek and Left Hand Creek there in Longmont. It was good land, and they were a successful colony also, certainly during the early years. The next two colonies I don't talk quite as much about, the St. Louis Western Colony and the Southwestern Colony, both in 1871. The St. Louis Western Colony goes into the Greeley area. Evans is just south and a little east of Greeley. It's agriculturally oriented to the same confluence that Greeley is. The Southwestern Colony in 1871 is in Green City, which is just east of Greeley, and they have some financial problems in 1873 and basically get absorbed by Greeley. Evans today is basically has been absorbed by Greeley and is a suburb of Greeley, so to speak. And so this is making use of the good agricultural land in that area. Also in 1871, as a lot of us know, is the Fountain Colony of Colorado. And so now we know a little bit more about why they're calling these the colonies. These are organized groups coming out, and the previous organized groups had called themselves colonies too. We've set up here for Fountain Colony in southern Colorado. The settlement was more oriented towards general commerce, driven by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad of Palmer. Not so much oriented specifically to agriculture, but of course, as we know, there was quite a bit of agriculture, both in the Fountain Colony area and then certainly in southern Colorado. Colonists like McAllister can have trees brought in on the railroad because this is a railroad-oriented town. The Denver and Rio Grande comes to the Fountain Colony in 1871 and soon thereafter goes down to Pueblo and continues up into the mountains. The colony benefits from agriculturalists that are south of the town that have been here just prior to 1871. One of those colonists is Robert Armstrong. He's a successful agriculturalist south of the Fountain Colony. He's growing apple, pear, and peach trees. His orchard is enclosed with a thick hedge of Osage orange. That's what this picture is right here. This is a plant that was famous for its use in the WPA to prevent soil erosion. Tens of thousands of Osage orange plants were grown. This is not fruit that we would want to eat. Animals eat it, but what it is it's really good for soil erosion and for blocking out wind and driving weather and protecting those apple orchards, those precious plants. And you can see that we've got our famous McAllister house picture here. This is the McAllister house. The reason I choose this picture because it gives us a great idea of what the natural vegetation on the high plains of Colorado are here. Basically nothing. These trees were planted by McAllister. Another individual that is related to the Fountain Colony and probably the best grower in the area was Robert Stubbs. He is one of the few that we get this full story about how he got into it too. He writes this down and describes the process at which he got into apple trees. He had been out here for a year, and in 1869 he decided to buy apple trees from a nursery in Kansas. So this is an individual that we've got an example of all the things that we've been talking about. And I described this a little bit for us here so we can see the extent and the cost that would have been absorbed by shipping trees first on rail to Kit Carson, and then on a wagon to Pueblo, and then up to Fountain, 125 miles by wagon. He plants them on June 1st on the second bottom, which would be the secondary floodplain of the of the river valley. He liberally manures and he irrigates. And take a look at this picture. This is a result of not pruning the apple trees. And the Colorado apple growers, certainly the ones that had harsh winters, were beginning to understand that this was the best situation you could be in, was not to prune your apple trees, so that these branches and leaves and fruit that are bending down would actually protect the trees from wind, from the hot sunlight in the summertime. So this was the state that was preferred for a lot of the growers, these kind of bending over apple trees, heavy with fruit, hopefully. His trees, so he plants in 1869 and his trees bear fruit in 1874. 5 years later, his trees bear fruit. Now, this is kind of important to understand, and this is why we talk about patience with apple trees, is that you're not going to get fruit from your trees for some amount of time. In very fruitful, sorry, pun intended, land, you might get fruit in 2 or 3 years, and in Colorado, where our soil nutrients are not quite as high, it'll take about 5 years, 4 or 5 years before you get fruit on the tree. So we talked a little bit about the fountain colony, and the fountain colony is a little bit different because it's based on general commerce and the railroad. And for that reason, El Paso County starts something called the Industrial Association, that is the precursor to any horticultural or pomological associations that are formed in El Paso County. It is formed in 1874, and it has its first fair in that year. There are prizes and premiums offered. Again, this is general industry. So we're talking about cattle, we're ranching, other types of industries, other agriculture, and orchards are just a part of this. So in Class E are farm, orchard, garden, and dairy products. In the paper that we can see that Captain DeCourcy offered $25 for the best display of fruits at that fair. The Out West newspaper or the printing company offered $10 for the best displays of fruits. And McAllister was not into pomology to a great extent at that time, it appears, because he offered his $20 for the best milch cows. Now, again, I have to admit, even though I grew up when I was young in North Dakota, I had to look up milch, and what that simply means is that it was a milking cow, of which they had one, and I'm sitting in the barn where that milch cow lived right at this very moment. It is commented in the newspaper that the best fruit display was from Fremont County, not from El Paso County. These fruit displays from Fremont County were based on invitations from El Paso County so that they could come up and show off their fruit. They were not oriented towards the prizes and premiums given out, but it was clear that the fruit growing in southern Colorado, south of El Paso County, was the best. So 2 more colonies, folks. South Pueblo Colony, which is basically started by Palmer and the Central Colorado Improvement Company, was like the Fountain Colony, was oriented to the railroad, except for that you've got the Arkansas River Valley right there, which is fantastic for agriculture. So you would have a considerable amount of agriculture there in the future, and it merges with Pueblo just a few years later. And then all the way at the northern end, Fort Collins is established in that same year. General Robert Cameron, who built the roads and did the original plats here in Colorado Springs, was president of that company, and it, of course, was agriculturally oriented also. So as I mentioned, during this period of time, the real success was seen in Fremont County. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time and show you how much success and how they had success down there. Take a look at this picture. I chose this one in particular because look, it's in upland, right? It's in the hills. They learned pretty quickly. Jesse Frazier was up in the hills. Other people were up in the hills, and they had a lot of success with the apple orchards, the drainage of the soil, just like grape crops in Europe and the great grape growing areas of the world. Upland, good drainage, that was the best for quality of fruit. In 1898, so a few years later, 48,000 barrels of apples were exported from that Fremont County. The leading varieties were the Jonathan, the Winesap, Ben Davis, Rome Beauty, Gano, and Delicious. And fruit culture really took hold in Canon City. That was really the nexus of the apple universe and other fruits here in Colorado in this period of development. And boy, did they develop apple culture in Canon City. They developed it to the point that they had a huge excess or surplus of apples. In order to deal with that surplus of apples, they did things like they created Fruit Day. And on Fruit Day, they gave away free fruit to everybody that came to visit. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was giving special rates to get down to Canon City from Denver and Fort Collins and Colorado Springs. And they were trying everything that they could possibly do to sell apples, and that's what led to the canning industry. So in Canon City, that's where we see the growth of the canning industry in Colorado. It was so popular locally there that high schools closed during harvest season so that everybody could go out and work the harvest. We talked about Fruit Day a little bit, of promotional activities. And just a fun little comment, in 1905, Canon City fruit growers sent a box of Canon City's finest apples to Teddy Roosevelt, who was in Colorado at the time, and they included a Colorado orange, which is a unique varietal that's propagated by Dahl DeWeese in the Canon City area. So I'd like to end with something that's a little bit contemplative. This has been a little bit straightforward as far as geographical and economic information. So let's shift over to the arts a little bit. And with remembering that McAllister, Major McAllister and Mrs. McAllister and General Palmer were lovers of poetry, let's just take a look at a Longfellow poem and see what we can glean out of this. It's interesting to see that we're actually looking at technical information in this very wordy, flowery sort of language from that time period. And I'm going to go ahead and read it. I'm going to give this a shot. So, come let us plant the apple tree, cleave the tough greensward with the spade, wide let its hollow bed be made. There gently lay the roots, and there sift the dark mold with kindly care, and press it o'er them tenderly, as round the sleeping infant's feet we softly fold the cradle sheet. So plant we the apple tree. Longfellow. In this poem, we actually have technical information. This gives us more than what at first glance we may see. He is actually talking about ways and methodologies of planting the trees, what needs to be done to the roots in order to make them successful, that they need to be treated very tenderly or they will get bruised and be problematic. But what I think that this really does is this shows us how the apple had infiltrated mainstream culture in England and certainly in the United States, and that culture had made its way all the way to Colorado, and certainly in a town like Canon City, that culture predominated for the better half of the end of the 19th century in Colorado. So that's the end of my presentation, folks. I'd really like to invite everybody again to join us on December 10th. That presentation will be a little bit more dynamic. It's going to be on the horticulture of the McAllister grounds, and we'll talk about a lot of fun things regarding the McAllisters, what they did, what they planted, how many, how much, and why they would have done such things. Why would they have taken the time to do that? I'm going to go ahead and take this off of share because I would love to engage in some conversation now about apples and Colorado history. And I hope that some of you have been stimulated to have some questions. I see one hand already. I'll go ahead and why don't you raise your hand on the camera? I'm going to take Stanzi's question first, if I may.
Hey, Eric, this was a fantastic presentation. I was enthralled the whole time. Recently in the Denver Post, there was a write-up about, I guess you'd call them palmitarians or palmitists, who are going around and trying to find these old ancient apple varieties around Colorado. And I wondered if you might speak to that, whether any of those still exist. I mean, Jonathan's still exist, but you mentioned a lot of those apples that I'm not familiar with, and I just wondered, are those still being cultivated, or is there this sort of like heritage kind of movement to make some of these older apple varieties popular again?
Well, this is going to be a tough one, Sanzi. Thanks for a great question. The thing that's going to be tough is that there are some people in the audience right now that know the answer a little bit better than that, than I do. And I know their names. I know who they are. And so maybe we could get some comments from some of those people. But basically, yes, the second reason, besides our interest here at McAllister House in apples, is that this actually is a hot topic at the moment. Now, some of you may not be in places where this is so hot. The hotbeds that I know of are Boulder. Boulder has continued a great interest in this. As a matter of fact, there's a symposium going on in the first week of December. To them in Boulder, they're looking at it in a community sort of way. So they're interacting, they're bringing back some of these legacies, and CU is doing some work, but it's kind of community effort. CSU up in Fort Collins has been doing great work for a long time. That's where your science of genetics is going on in the state, and they're very active right now. And then of course we've got this MORP in the Western Slope. And we didn't address the Western Slope in this conversation. Basically, to cut to a quick, once Canon City apples, people discover on the Western Slope that it grows apples very good, then that economy in Canon City shifts to the West Slope, and it dies in Canon City to some extent, petering out around 1920. So that has shifted to that great soil out there on the Western Slope. And then, of course, you've got people like the McAllister House, and you've got people that are interested in the craft movement, hard ciders being produced, soft ciders being produced. And to somebody who lived in New England, I'm from Colorado, but I lived in New England, you see that all the time, right? I drive down the street and there's hard cider and soft cider, and I can apple pick and all that. But that has come west in the last 20 years and is a very popular concept. So that's another reason why I'm doing this now, is that hopefully for all of us, and me included, we can know a little bit more about that and about how that drove our history here in Colorado. Thank you, Stunzi. Anybody else want to wave? Susan, you got anything to add there? I see Stacy's significant other there, so I'll take that
one. Kind of off topic on the apple, but the Osage orange windrow plant looked interesting. I'm not familiar with that at all. Did you find anything else on that?
The popularity comes in later on in the 20th century, and with the Works Progress Administration, that was the primary wind block tree that was planted, tens of thousands of them across our country. So kind of like some of these other plants, they're probably there in some states and that we just don't really know them. It is not an edible fruit. Humans don't want to eat that. So that green, funny looking piece of fruit, animals eat it. It is a very coarse, very hardy plant, and so it's great to block wind and rain, and so it's often set up, as farmers do, as a wind block on the outsides of their orchard. So that was the primary reason for bringing it up.
It's also extremely thorny.
So it keeps
thorny. It keeps out animals.
Any other comments on that?
You don't get the cattle coming in or the deer.
Oh,
and
okay,
I read, Susan, tell me if this is wrong, I read that even insects, it's even good at repelling some of the insects. It's so coarse and thorny that even smaller animals are not really wanting to go through that. So it was very effective. Some of these growers suggested that it wasn't necessary to put them on the outsides of your orchard, that you could just put your crabapple trees on the outside of your orchard and you would get fruit off of them, and they would create that block, blocking the wind and the sun to some extent. That concept is really important for us in Colorado. We know that the sun beats down on us hard when it's hot, and we know here, certainly in the Pikes Peak region, that the wind bears down on you when it's windy, and protecting the base of those trees was really important. So McAllister advocated for putting boards up, wooden boards against the windy side so that couldn't affect it and that would block the sun, or gunny material, gunny sacks wrapped around the base of your orchards would protect them, and then they could survive the winter.
Okay. Makes sense. So that Osage orange would probably be considered an invasive species now.
Almost, yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Anybody have any other questions or anything to add?
Eric, this is Judith. I wanted to add that people can get on the mailing list from MORP, the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project, which is undoubtedly the most exciting one in the state. And they just recently, in the last year, got an enormous grant from the Nature Conservancy to expand the orchard spaces. And they've managed to identify a lot of the trees using genetic material. I'm particularly impressed because all of the schools in Montezuma County have school gardens, which I'm a big advocate of. And all of them now also have orchards, because MORP has really worked with the schools in order to install orchards with the schools. And as a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson, I just want to mention that he particularly liked the Osage orange. And there are a number of them on the campus of the University of Virginia. And I can't tell you why he liked the Osage orange.
Oh, come on, that's what I was going to ask you.
some particular advantages. And then I like to talk about apples in Colorado Springs in terms of the Dixon apple. Dixon owned a ranch right at the mouth of Cheyenne Canyon and was famous for the apples. And what's interesting is it was purchased in the early 1900s by a very wealthy woman who came out here from New England, she and her husband, the Poppers, and they both sadly died very quickly. Interestingly enough, I've been researching the family. Apparently they were both alcoholics, and that contributed to their death. But they bought a lot of the Dixon Ranch and they established a home there. And the home was built by Horace Tombauer, who's a very famous East Coast architect. And that home that they had built was purchased in 1916 by the Penroses, and it's now El Pomar. And the name actually didn't come with the Penroses. The name was there before with the couple who built the home. So that's really significant for Colorado Springs history. And then of course, Chambers Ranch, the Chambers, had lots of fruit trees, especially apples and cherries. And they sold the fruit to local hotels. And then Mrs. Chambers was known for canning and sold the preserves during the winter. So we actually have quite an apple tradition in Colorado Springs.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do you know what the acronym MORP stands for, Judith? Can you
The Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project.
And am I correct in saying that it's primarily genealogical? That's really what they're wanting to do, is to preserve the legacy of some of those varietals, right?
Yeah, because there's some huge number that early on, if you looked at seed catalogs and whatnot, there were like 7,000 varieties in the United States, and it's shrunk down to a very little. My book club read a really fun book called Eating on the Wild Side. It's by a nutritionist who talks about how a lot of our foods have lost all of their value, nutritional value, because they've been propagated in order to store for a long time and to be uniform in color and size. And the one that she names is one that has almost no nutritional value whatsoever, is the grocery store Yellow Delicious. That in terms of nutritional value, it's like almost zero, which is kind of interesting. And so I think it's felt that a lot of those ancient varieties have a lot more nutritional value. They haven't been bred for shipping and for storage.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Judith. Any other questions or comments, folks?
I had a question about when you were talking about barreling,
Mhm.
and you said that the apples were cured and then cooled and put into the barrels. And I wondered what the curing process involved, if you knew.
So it was a period of time that the apples would be let sitting. And it basically was mimicking the British way of preserving them, is just laying them on shelves, right, in a relatively dry and cool area for a short period of time, a couple weeks. And they're curing, the moisture is evaporating a little bit, they're curing, and that way they're going to be transported better. So the sources that I looked at, that's what they were doing before they put them in barrels and began to export them around the world. And certainly this is the fruition of the Jeffersonian concept, but also of the economy potential of the New World, right? So it's kind of ironic that when we're talking about apples, those Brits were paying more for their own local apples than they were for the American imported apples. And by the way, they like the taste of them better. So we were doing a pretty good job with the genes and the propagation. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on the 10th, because we've always wondered what the McAllisters did in their attic, why they didn't make that another bedroom for their son. The hypothesis, the working hypothesis is that they had a lot of different types of propagation, curing, things like that, that needed dry, cool space, and that their cellar might not have been appropriate. It might have been too moist for some of those things. And so they might have been doing science in that attic. I think that's a pretty cool concept. I don't have proof of that yet. It's just a hypothesis. Well, thank you all so much. It's great to see your faces. We'd love to see you on December 10th. And stay safe and healthy, everyone. And we hope to see everyone soon, okay?
Thank you,
very
Eric.
much. Thank you.
Great.
Very
Bye,
nice.
everybody.
Great
Thank you,
presentation.
Thank you, Eric.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night.